Good evening and welcome to the CNN Green Party Town Hall. This is your chance to get to know the candidates behind a party that promises a real alternative in November.
For voters tired of this.
Friends don't let friends vote for Trump.
Has anybody lied as much as Hillary Clinton?
They're promising something truly different.
When we stand up together, we are unstoppable. We say no to the lesser evil.
For voters who wonder why them, they say, why not?
We got a future that we got to take back.
To skeptics who say they could hand the election to Trump or to Clinton, they answer,
we are what democracy looks like!
Green Party nominee Jill Stein, running mate Ajamu Baraka, aiming to reshape the race, to join the debate, and more.
Turn the White House into a greenhouse!
Can their message get traction? Can their difference really make a difference?
We are the ones we've been waiting for!
Your questions for the ticket promising better answers tonight.
All right, welcome to all of you who are joining us here in New York, across the country, and around the world. We're being simulcast tonight on CNN International, CNN en Español, CNN Go, and SiriusXM Satellite Channel 116. This is our first Green Party Town Hall. We're bringing it to you in no small part because voters, many of you, keep expressing a desire for a third-party alternative. So with us here tonight, some of those voters, most of them undecided. And guess what? They've got questions. As always, the questions come mainly from the audience in these town halls. We've looked them over, of course, to make sure they don't overlap. I'm going to be asking a few myself as well. So what do you say? Let's get to it. Joining us right now is Green Party presidential candidate Dr. Jill Stein. She is a trained physician, ran for president in 2012 on the Green Party ticket. Vice presidential candidate Ajamu Baraka is a longtime human rights activist, a grassroots organizer as well. Welcome to you both.
Good. Thank you very much.
All right, Doctor, let's start with the basics. The Green Party. Tell the audience tonight what matters about this party. What does it offer that is better than everything else out there?
So the unique thing about the Green Party is that we are the one national party that is not corrupted by corporate money, by lobbyist money, or by super PACs. So we have the unique ability to actually stand up for what it is that the American people want, what everyday people want. That is, we have a jobs emergency, and we call for an emergency jobs program that will actually solve the emergency of climate change that we are seeing in the floods and the fires and the heat waves across this country that are so painful to watch right now. This is what the future looks like if we don't stand up and start doing something about it. We're the one party that's actually calling for canceling student debt and bailing out a generation of young people like we bailed out the bankers on Wall Street. We can do that for this generation and unleash them to be the stimulus package of our dreams and make higher education free and health care as a human right and create a welcoming path to citizenship, end police violence, and a foreign policy that's based on international law, human rights, and economic justice, not on military and economic domination, which is blowing back at us so catastrophically. So, in short, we're standing up for everyday people and an America and a future that works for all of us.
Now, Doctor, speak to yourself individually as a candidate. Why do you believe you represent a better choice than the other candidates?
You know, I'm a mother and a medical doctor. I'm in this really because I know there's no future for my kids unless there's a future for all kids. I'm not a professional politician. I don't need a job as a politician. I've never had a job as a politician. I've been a part of the social movements, really struggling for our health, for jobs, for an environment that's healthy for us instead of these epidemics of asthma that we have, the epidemic of diabetes tied into our food supply. I got into this really, excuse me, as a medical doctor, looking at this tide of illnesses that we didn't used to have, and feeling like it wasn't enough to just give people pills and push them back out to the things that are making us sick. So I got involved with our communities to help correct these problems at their basics. So now I'm practicing not clinical medicine, but political medicine, so we can heal our political system and start to actually fix these problems that are threatening not only life and limb, but our very existence on this planet.
Plenty of obvious symptoms. So let's talk about the man to your right, your choice of running mate Ajamu Baraka. Why was he your choice?
Because he is an inspirational and passionate advocate for justice and for human rights. And we are at a crisis moment in this country and even globally, a crisis of injustice, of racial injustice and economic injustice. We need a national conversation right now so that we can get past this moment of police violence and this economic violence, this mass incarceration system that has so devastated our communities. And Ajamu's background is all about these struggles for justice, and for us to bring this conversation from our different perspectives and our different backgrounds. This is exactly the conversation that America needs to have right now so we can heal and become one community and move forward based on our human rights and our human values.
So, Mr. Baraka, what is it that is motivating your interest in this election? What is your message to the voters?
My motivation is that this is a critical moment that we have an opportunity to do something really different. I mean, I joined this ticket because I believe in Jill Stein. I believe in this party. The Green Party is the only vehicle we have right now that can offer a real alternative. You know, people are not ready to accept the notion that we have to be held hostage to these two elite parties. People are willing to gamble with the possibility that we can really build something new and different. So I think in 2016, we have this kind of historic opportunity. As Dr. Stein said, you know, my whole life has been about building alternative power. It's about speaking truth to power. It's about understanding that it is the people themselves that have the possibility to transform their conditions and transform themselves. So that's my motivation too, after all these years, to step into this electoral process, to be subjected to the kinds of dirty politics involved in this, because I really believe that at this moment we have a real possibility of moving forward collectively in a new way.
All right, so the question then becomes, well, how do you do that? All right, this is a process. You get exposure. You do a lot of it online. We're giving you an opportunity here at CNN. We believe it's part of our duty to the process to represent all the different parties that are options. But that's not enough. The debate stage has a requirement, 15%. The media doesn't design it. As you well know, there's a committee that does it, that is staffed. They've come up with 15% of 5 national polls that they pick. You're nowhere near that. The Libertarian candidate is nowhere near that. Together, you're not even near. So you sued, it didn't work. What do you do to get the exposure you will need to be competitive?
So, you know, this is not going to get decided in a court of law. Excuse me. I think it will get decided in the court of public opinion. This is about we the people standing up. As Americans, we not only have a right to vote, we have a right to know who we can vote for. And the Commission on Presidential Debates is not just an ordinary public interest commission. It's a private corporation that is run, excuse me, of, by, and for the Democratic and Republican parties. The League of Women Voters quit the debates when the commission came forward, and they quit saying this is a fraud being committed on the American voters, because it allows these two parties to set a standard for admission that silences political opposition. We have a right to know who our choices are. There are 4 candidates who will be on the ballot, that is 4 candidates for president, who will be on the ballot for just about every voter in the country that have the numerical possibility to actually win the election, that represents a much greater diversity of choices than just Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, where one of them is a member of the billionaire club, but the other one has actually been quite an ally and an advocate for the billionaire club. So the American people deserve to hear from people who are not part of that economic elite and the political system that serves it. So I want to encourage people to go to Jill2016.com and sign up on our campaign to open up the debates, and hold on to your hat and stay tuned, because I don't think the American people are going to take this sitting down. There is too much at stake. We need real democracy.
Question about your opponents. One of the big markers in this process is when the main candidates wind up getting their first intel briefing. Donald Trump got his today. Hillary Clinton's going to get one very soon. Critics of Clinton have said, because of what happened with the email server, and I'm bringing it up because it's been you've been very robust on this issue, they say she has shown an inability to deal with classified material. She should not get the briefing. Do you agree with that?
You know, I'm not. I have not been informed yet on exactly the nature of this briefing, but I will say she's under a lot of pressure right now. You know, and she's being very carefully scrutinized. Part of the problem, you know, with Hillary's abuse of the rules, she was sort of too big, you know, too big to jail on the rules, and she violated those rules with a sense of impunity. And she violated them for a purpose which she stated herself, that she wanted her private information private. Now, it turns out half of her emails she deleted as private. If someone is working for you and half of their emails on the job are for their private personal foundation, it really raises questions. So I do have serious questions about Hillary's judgment, her safeguarding of national security information, and above all, her trustworthiness in the job where she will have her finger on the button, given how she handled major decisions both around the war in Iraq, but then especially around the war in Libya, where she led the charge. So yes, I have serious concerns about Hillary. That's why I'm in this race, to provide an alternative to people who don't like Donald Trump. You know, you have more alternatives out there than just Hillary Clinton.
Speaking of Mr. Trump, Mr. Baraka, he's shaking up his campaign. Why? Well, what the outward signs are that he's getting ready to double down on what he believes got him here in the first place. He's going to go right back at Hillary Clinton, forget the teleprompter, forget about messages and all these speeches. I'm going to get after her, and that's what I do best. Now, many people are concerned that that's going to make what seems very negative already like a scorched earth environment. Now, you're no stranger to heated rhetoric, but do you have a concern about what this election may descend into, which means not talking about any of these people, but really devolving into a conversation about who's the worst person?
Well, I am, because it has really harmed the possibility of real democracy here in this country. When you have someone like Donald Trump and what he represents, the kind of dark forces he has been appealing to, it's only going to result in a continued deterioration of the democratic practice and process here in this country. You know, we're going to have to deal with Donald Trump even after the election, win or lose, because he is appealing to a social base that is prepared to continue to embrace some of the darker side of humanity. His appeal to folks who embrace xenophobia, racism, his bigotry around religion, the unfortunate reality is that it has resonated with some elements of this society. So, you know, if he's committed to doing that, that's fine. We are going to have an alternative message. We're going to talk about what is best in this country, in this society. We're going to talk about our possibilities. We're going to talk about why we need to build a new kind of social justice movement here in this country, a new kind of democracy. So we confront the Donald Trumps with a positive message of hope and a positive message of real change here in this country.
Now, a follow-up on that is, please. People will say, well, you know what? When Donald Trump is speaking in what some would call negatively, it's actually what he's doing is he's speaking the truth. Now, that is a criticism that's been leveled against you as well. When you've talked about the President of the United States, Barack Obama, you've referred to him in very ugly ways that are very negative. You're talking about being hopeful and aspirational. Mm-hmm. How do you reconcile that with what you've called the President of the United States?
Well, as you say, you have to basically call it as you see it. And be prepared to speak truth to power. And my concern, my critique of Barack Obama was that Barack Obama had an historic opportunity to transform this country. He appeared not to be prepared for the moment. He allowed his commitment to neoliberal policies and a neoliberal worldview to undermine the possibility of greatness for this man. So, you know, I know that people had a tremendous amount of hopes and dreams in Barack Obama, but he did not live up to that possibility. He in fact has provided cover for the continuation of policies that have had a detrimental impact on working people in this country and even minorities. So my responsibility is to call it as I see it.
There are legitimate arguments to be made. Obviously, you're receiving applause for them, but yes. You called him an Uncle Tom. Now, that's a little bit different than making legitimate arguments, right? Do you see what I'm saying here?
Well, you know, in that conversation, it was to a specialized audience that understood the context and the reason why I framed that in that way.
Is there any good context?
Well, it's not good to be Uncle Tom either. No, there's no good Tom, none of that. What I wanted to do was basically to tell people who had still had this hope in Barack Obama that if we were concerned and serious about how we could displace white power, we had to demystify the policies and the positions of this individual. So that was how it got framed, to sort of shock people into a more critical look at this individual, and that's how I did it, and I stand by that, even though it sounds very inflammatory and provocative and probably very strange to this massive audience here tonight.
And for you, Dr. Stein, when you're making the decision to pick Mr. Baraka, obviously he was your choice. That didn't bother you. You saw past it. Explain to the audience, once they start getting deeper into seeing both your backgrounds, this is going to come up. What do you want them to know?
Yeah, I am so grateful that we have an opportunity to go beyond sound bites. And I understand Ajamu's passion, his frustration, and his struggle. And I also understand his transcendence and the way in which this is a challenge to us all right now, to both feel the passion of our struggle, but also to be capable of transcending it and connecting with each other, healing our wounds, and forging a bigger vision and the bigger community that we have to be if we are going to survive in this country and in this world. So, you know, I think we have all been guilty of using some language that doesn't play well as a soundbite. And I look forward to having the longer conversation that allows us to actually see, and I worked with Ajamu for years, so I know that I have never heard him use derogatory language, to tell you the truth. And I only know his kind of steady, inspired, visionary kind of discussion that I find very inspiring, and I see him inspiring lots of people from many different backgrounds and bringing us together, and I think that is the challenge of our moment.
Well, there is a big conversation to be had. You are right, and guess what? We're going to have it tonight. There are a lot of questions for you on a range of issues, and we're going to get to them. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to give the floor to the audience. It is time for their questions. You are watching the CNN Green Party Town Hall. Stay with us. We're back to the Green Party Town Hall. Time now for questions from the audience. Our first is from Gloria So. She's a student at Columbia University. She did support Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primaries, but now she's undecided. She says she is leaning in favor of Hillary Clinton. So, Doctor, Mr. Baraka, here is your shot to win her over. Go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Stein. My question today is, what would you like to say to win over Sanders supporters like me who are absolutely not voting for Trump but are feeling somewhat disillusioned by Clinton?
Great. So first, what I would say is thank you so much for having changed the political landscape forever. So big thank you to all of the Sanders supporters. And the political system will never be the same. And what I have to say is that you've learned really in real time why it is that you can't have a revolutionary campaign in a counter-revolutionary party. Bernie did everything right, and his supporters did everything right, but the playing field was really steeply and unfairly tilted against you, from superdelegates to Super Tuesdays to voting irregularities to the emails that showed how the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, was colluding behind closed doors with Hillary Clinton's campaign to smear Bernie Sanders in the press. And this was extremely unfair. And then Hillary now, has really moved to court Republicans, has sort of an official committee to bring Republicans over. She's appointed a centrist vice presidential candidate. They did not allow some of the Sanders spokespeople to have a role in the at the convention. Bernie himself was relegated to a very low-profile role. So what I'd say is all the work you did and the incredible passion and vision and blood, sweat, and tears that you put into that campaign, that lives on. And Bernie himself said, it's a movement, it's not a man. And it's clear Hillary does not represent what you were working for. Our campaign has been here from the start. Many people have looked to us from Bernie's campaign as Plan B, so that if they ran into trouble, they could continue building this revolutionary campaign, but now all the stronger for being inside of a revolutionary party that supports the work that you're doing and will continue to build it until we prevail.
Now, Mr. Baraka, the polls show about 7 in 10 Sanders supporters say they're going to go with Hillary Clinton, but they're varying degrees of strength. So they're going to do their research. They're going to see that on party platforms, the Green Party does line up with a lot of the things that Senator Sanders was fighting for. But when they do their research, I want to give you an opportunity to clear up some of the things you've said about Senator Sanders, because not all of it was flattering. The main idea you had was that Bernie Sanders should be seen as an ideological prop. And that there was an idea of nativism to his campaign, an idea of complementing white supremacy to his campaign. What did you mean by those statements for when the Sanders supporters come looking your way?
Well, what we had to do was to raise some issues that seemed to be at one point very troubling. Chris, I wanted to feel the burn. I really did. And so, as Dr. Stein said, I saw from the very beginning the real possibility for this campaign to really expand the scope of conversation here in this country, to introduce to the American people a term like democratic socialism, to really tap into this desire that people had for real change. But I was troubled by some other tendencies, and that is that we can't build a progressive or revolutionary process by just looking at the United States of America. that, you can't disconnect U.S. foreign policy from domestic policy. And so I was concerned by some of the comments around, allowing the Saudis to get their hands dirty, because many of us who follow geopolitical events understand that not only were the Saudis' hands dirty, they were dripping with blood. And so my point was that Bernie needed to understand that the American people were ready for a real progressive candidate. You don't have to play into the hands of the Democrats. You don't have to embrace Barack Obama's drone program. You don't have to suggest that, or be silent about other foreign policy issues. So I wanted to see a real comprehensive, progressive campaign, and the people were ready for that. So
why didn't you say that instead of hitting them over the head with being a tool of white supremacist ethical contradictions that reinforces racist cynicism? Why'd you have to hit him over the head with that, Senator Sanders, if you wanted to feel the burn? That's not trying to feel the burn.
Yeah, because I wanted him to deal. I wanted his supporters to deal with those contradictions. Like Dr. Stein said, this wasn't about the man; it was about the movement. We've got to disconnect personalities from movement building. And we've got to, if we see contradictions, we have to engage in those conversations with our friends. This was a conversation among those of us on the left, progressive people. The Sanders supporters were pushing back, when people were raising questions with the Sanders folks, they were saying, oh, you all are purists, you're dogmatists. And my comment in that article was, look, there are some serious questions being raised. I never wrote an entire article on the Sanders campaign, but I was pushing back saying, look, you can't just dismiss the critique. If we want to be serious about really building progressive power in this country, talking about our conversation among ourselves, we've got to deal with these contradictions. So, if you only look at the U.S., if you only prop up life in the U.S., you are privileging life in the U.S., you're privileging white life when the Saudis and others are involved in killing black and brown people around the world.
We have a question that goes to America's reach around the world. Now let's bring in Alexander McCoy. He's a former Marine Corps sergeant. He's from Rhode Island, and he served in Saudi Arabia, Germany, and Honduras. He's now a student at Columbia University. He says he's leaning towards supporting Secretary Clinton. Interestingly, for you, Alexander, Mr. Baraka, I believe, is the only person who served active duty in the armed forces in the race right now. So what's your question, sir?
Dr. Stein, you said that you oppose the use of U.S. forces overseas. U.S. forces are currently engaged in airstrikes against ISIS and other military operations. My question is, do you consider ISIS to be a threat to the U.S. or to U.S. allies and partners in the Middle East? And if so, what would you do to defeat ISIS that the Obama administration is not currently doing?
So, there are rules of engagement, international rules, that if you're going to attack another country, you need to be at imminent threat of being actually attacked by them. Clearly, that threshold has not been met. ISIS is not about to launch a major attack against our country. And we have a track record now of fighting terrorism, not only ISIS, but Al-Qaeda before it, the Taliban before that. And this track record is not looking so good. We have spent $6 trillion, according to a recent Harvard study, when you include the costs, the ongoing costs of health care for our wounded veterans who deserve the highest care possible. $6 trillion, which since 2001. We have killed 1 million people in Iraq alone, which is not winning us the hearts and minds in the Middle East. We have lost tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers that have been killed or severely wounded. And what do we have to show for this? Failed states, mass refugee migrations, and repeated terrorist threats that get worse with each cycle. So ISIS grew out of the catastrophe of Iraq. Al-Qaeda, in turn, grew out of Afghanistan. And in fact, in Afghanistan, it was the CIA and the Saudis together who created the first so-called jihadi movement with the Mujahideen in order to make trouble against the Soviet Union. So this has been a very ill-conceived plan that has been backfiring madly against us. So what we say is that we need a new kind of offensive in the Middle East, because bombing terrorism and shooting terrorism is not quelling terrorism. It's only fanning the flames of terrorism, the misery and the poverty that drive terrorism. We are calling for a new kind of offensive, a peace offensive in the Middle East that begins with a weapons embargo. And since we are supplying, the U.S. is supplying the majority of the weapons to actually all combatants, we and our allies are arming most of the fighting forces in the Middle East, we can initiate that weapons embargo. And we also call for a freeze on the funding of those countries who continue to support jihadi terrorist enterprises. Hillary Clinton herself said in a leaked State Department memo that, in fact, the Saudis are still the major funder of terrorist Sunni enterprises. So if we started it, we and our allies have the capacity to shut it down. So that's how we need to move forward.
So, Doctor, just to be clear, you said you call for a military spending cut of 50%. You want all foreign bases closed. There's no question that this is a complex problem. It's not just a military solution, but the military is almost always involved in different reckonings of a solution. Are you saying that there'd be no U.S. military presence anywhere else in the world and that would keep America safe?
So we now have somewhere between 700 or 800 or even more military bases around the world. Do you know how many military bases all other countries combined have? About 30. There's something really wrong with this picture. Do you know? Do you know how much of our budget actually goes to maintaining this bloated and dangerous military budget? 54% of our discretionary budget, which is about half of your income tax, is going to this failed, catastrophic policy of regime change.
But I'm just trying to be clear. Would you close all of them?
That would be our presumption. There may be certain bases for certain circumstances that need to remain open. But our presumption is to close the bases. And our presumption is also to shut down the weapon systems like the F-35 that will cost us almost $1.5 trillion before we're done, or to shut down the new generation of nuclear weapons, which has no role whatsoever in military or on the planet. We need to be backing off and phasing out all nuclear weapons now, not moving forward with a new $1 trillion program for new nuclear weapons.
Mr. Baraka?
You know, Chris, there's an assumption in your question that we have to take a look at, and that is that that we're going to be able to respond in a military fashion to all of these various threats. See, one of the reasons why we have the ISIS threat today is because of the enormous incompetency of U.S. policy in the so-called Middle East over the last 16 years. Mm-hmm. You can't, talk about the ISIS threat and then not look at the kinds of policies that help to facilitate the growth of ISIS. You can't talk about your concern about the possibility of imminent attacks in the U.S. and support policies that created a territory in Syria where people were able to train, equip themselves, and be prepared to launch attacks all over the world. So I would invite the American people to look critically at the policies pursued by both the Bush and the Obama administrations that helped to create the problem that we now have. Look, the security issue is real. There's no question about that. Okay? And people are concerned about that, and we understand that. But this sort of knee-jerk response in terms of military action, we've got to be very, very critical of that. And because this notion of militarism has been sold to the American population, and people, just think that the first reaction is a military one, when what we're looking at is a political and an ideological challenge also that the U.S. foreign policy has played right into.
Let's get to another question. Jasmine Rebedavia. She is a second-grade teacher from New York City. How badly did I mangle your name, by the way? Let me hear it the right way.
Rebadavia.
Oh, so close. I said it that way in rehearsal.
Very close.
You're currently undecided. What's your question?
Yes. Hi, Dr. Stein. First off, thanks so much for your time this evening.
Thank you.
I'm interested to hear more about your personal faith or your personal beliefs. I understand you grew up in a Reformed Jewish household. Do you currently believe in God? And could you tell us more about your personal journey in this area?
Great. So I grew up a very religious person. I was probably the most religious person in my family. And I actually brought traditional Jewish ritual into my family because I was so excited about what was going on in my Reformed temple where I sang in the choir. And certainly my view of the world, I have to say, just grew out of the morality and the tales that I was learning from the Old Testament. You know, now I'm actually in a mixed family, and I am not actively practicing any religion, but I certainly have a very strong sense of our moral and human what should we say, fiber, something that is spiritual, that is kind of beyond our actual grasp, that inspires me and gives me great faith in other people and our capacity to be more than the sum of our parts. So I don't fall into any particular religious box or conventional view, but I certainly carry on that spirit that inspired me way back when.
Jasmine Rebadavia, thank you very much for being with us. Another question. I want you to meet Dr. Diane Hess. She's a pediatrician here in New York City. She's an independent and says she's still deciding whom to vote for.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
So my question is, as a pediatrician, I do not allow non-vaccinated patients, nor patients whose parents want to delay the vaccine schedule, into my practice. I care for many children who are immunocompromised or too young to get some vaccines, such as measles or whooping cough, which is an epidemic now, and they're very susceptible to these diseases. So when I was reading your statements, you seem to support vaccines, yet you're evasive about your schedule or the support of the schedule. So I just wanted you to clarify that for me.
So that statement about the schedule was taken out of context. So when I was practicing and following issues around immunization, which I am not now, there were concerns at the time about the mercury dose in vaccines and how kids might be loaded up in a way related to that schedule and the presence of thimerosal in the vaccines. And that's what I was referring to, that there were legitimate questions at that time. But I understand those, you know, the thimerosal has been taken out of the vaccines, anything that would be given to a child, and it's no longer an issue. I think there's kind of an effort to divert the conversation from our actual agenda, because the idea that I oppose vaccines is completely ridiculous, or that I'm anti-science. And I would encourage anybody to go look up the books that I co-authored with other physicians and public health experts at Physicians for Social Responsibility. One is called Environmental Threats to Healthy Aging, Toxic Threats to Child Development. Those are two books, actually, that are both available for free on the web. You can read them on the web or download them. They both review science, and they review scientific studies to have a better understanding of what is the conditions that may be driving the developmental disabilities, what may be contributing to these issues that we're seeing, and likewise, what are some of the contributors to chronic disease in adults. There are clearly, you know, environmental factors here that are playing a role. So just for policy wonks, for geeks, for science geeks, you can show yourself, if you have any doubt, that I too am a science geek. I am certainly not hostile to science. I'm not anti-science. I believe that asking questions is part of our responsibility as scientists and as physicians. We always need to be asking those questions.
Dr. Hess, thank you for the question. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we have more audience questions here at the CNN Green Party Town Hall. right, you are watching the CNN Green Party Town Hall. Let's continue with questions from the audience. We have Marcella Aberdeen. She's a market research analyst from Washington, D.C. She's a registered Democrat, but she is currently leaning towards supporting you, Dr. Stein, in November. What's your question?
Hi, thanks. You tweeted during a Democratic town hall at Hillary Clinton a statement that I agree with as a feminist, and it read, "In order for women to achieve equality around the world, a feminist cannot be an imperialist and a warmonger." Can you talk a little bit more about this statement? Specifically, Can you talk about the way in which you think your feminism is different from Hillary Clinton's and the implication that would have on foreign policy?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Really important question. In my view, you know, it takes a village to raise a child. In my view, being a feminist has a lot to do with nurturing our children. It's about equal rights for women, but it's also about kind of a special vision for women that we are the caretakers of children, of our parents, of our communities. There's something about us that just wants to take care of people. And to me, that's the height of feminism. And that is not compatible with just, you know, taking care of your own private family. And, you know, as important as that is, you know, we must care for our own kids. They're our special, you know, treasure and legacy. But that we have a responsibility to be that community so that all mothers everywhere have the ability to care for their kids and to deliver a just future for them. And many of Hillary's positions, whether it was helping to destroy the social safety net, aid to families with dependent children, welfare as we knew it, was basically destroyed by the Clintons, who wanted to replace it with something else that put millions more kids into poverty. Whether it was the Wall Street deregulation, again cheered on by both Bill and Hillary, that led to the meltdown and the loss of 9 million jobs and the theft of 5 million homes, largely from communities of color and lower income families. And then the war effort that Hillary has especially been, you know, the engine behind, whether Iraq or Libya. She wants to go into Syria and create a so-called no-fly zone, which risks going to war with Russia that's already in that airspace, which would be a very scary thing to do. So to my mind, that's just not compatible with what my view of feminism is, that has a responsibility not just to your own family, but to all families and to the human family.
Another question. Let's bring in Andrew Fader. He's a software engineer from the Bronx. He supported Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary. He's now leaning toward supporting Hillary Clinton, but this is your chance. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chris. Dr. Stein, given the way our political system works, effectively you could help Donald Trump like Ralph Nader helped George Bush in 2000. How could you sleep at night?
I will have trouble sleeping at night if Donald Trump is elected. I will also have trouble sleeping at night if Hillary Clinton is elected. And as despicable as Donald Trump's words are, I find Hillary Clinton's actions and track record is very troubling. So Donald Trump, you know, bashes immigrants and is a xenophobic and racist loudmouth. But Hillary Clinton, you know, has been promoting these wars that have killed 1 million black and brown people in Iraq, for example. The Democratic Party has become the party of deportation and detentions and night raids, with, you know, millions of people deported under Barack Obama. Some of them include the refugees from Honduras, where Hillary Clinton gave the thumbs up to a coup from which thousands of people have been fleeing, who have not been welcomed into this country. And Hillary, in fact, has supported many of the White House policies of deportation and detentions. On, you know, the issue of nuclear war, I am very concerned about trouble breaking out in Syria in this air war that Hillary is threatening to have. So, you know, as disturbing as Donald Trump's talk is, I find Hillary Clinton's track record is actually very much of concern too. This politics of fear that tells you you've got to vote against the person you most dislike or the person you are most afraid of, that politics of fear has a track record, because a lot of people have been, you know, that's been like the prevailing mythology. You got to vote your fears, not your values. And what has that delivered? You know, all the reasons you're told to vote for the lesser evil, because you didn't want the expanding wars, you didn't want the meltdown of the climate, or the Wall Street bailouts, or the deportation of immigrants. That's exactly what we've gotten by allowing ourselves to be silenced. So in my view, we need to reject the lesser evil and fight for the greater good, like our lives depend on it, because in fact they do.
But can you actually win in this system?
Great question. Yes, and
what'd you say, Andrew? I didn't hear you.
Can you actually win in the corrupt, rigged political system that we have? Is it actually possible for you to even come close?
So let me say first, it's definitely not possible for us to win with two corporate political parties that are funded both by big banks, by fossil fuel giants, by war profiteers, and by insurance companies. We are not winning. There may be differences between the two parties, but not enough to save your job, to save your life, or to save the planet. Here's how we can win. There are 43 million young people and not so young people who are trapped in predatory student loan debt. That is a winning plurality of the vote. Ours is the only campaign that will cancel that debt and bail out young people like the establishment bailed out Wall Street. When that word gets out to 43 million people that they can actually come out and take over this election and cancel that debt, we could see something happen, not splitting the vote, but potentially flipping the vote, so that we who are the underdog deserve to be the top dog and actually could be the top dog if we stand up with the courage of our convictions. It's not only 43 million young people locked into student debt with no future. The birth rate is plummeting in this country, which is a real sign of a human rights catastrophe going on before our very eyes. So we don't really have a future right now to offer our younger generation. For them, there's nothing to lose and there's everything to gain by standing up, excuse me, knowing that we could actually win this if we stand up with the courage of our convictions.
We'll talk about how you can erase student debt and a lot of other big issues when we come back. Let's take a quick break. More questions on the other side. Stay with us for the Green Party Town Hall. Welcome back to the Green Party Town Hall here on CNN. Dr. Stein, you're talking about a very provocative and intriguing concept. You said there are 43 million people out there carrying student debt, right? And I know that number, and some estimate that number could be twice that if you look at all the people who continue to carry it up well into adulthood. Many people say it is the new mortgage of this generation. So the question becomes, something as enticing as erasing all student debt begs the question. How could you ever do that? How?
So let me say first, we found a way to bail out Wall Street. And when we needed the money, we found it, including about $17 trillion worth of practically zero interest loans, which was made available as needed. We found a way to bail out Wall Street, the guys that crashed the economy with their waste, fraud, and abuse. So my point is, as responsible adults, we need to bail out a younger generation that is held hostage in this unpayable student debt. It's terrible for them. It's terrible for our whole society, because it's always the younger generation that leads us forward to create the economy of the future and to lead the social changes that we urgently need right now.
But the concept itself, as enticing as it is, There's one apples to oranges thing here. Quantitative easing, which you've talked about, TARP, TALF, whatever acronym you want to throw at how we dealt with the banks in 2008, right or wrong. Those loans, zero interest in some cases, some not, were repaid.
That's right.
So that would not erase student debt, right? Because no matter what interest rate is, you still got the principal.
Right.
So how do you do this? Because it's not going to be the same mechanism as you had with the banks, because they repaid the loans.
That's right.
And how would you ever get a Congress that wants to do nothing like this to do anything like this?
So, you know, it was easy for the banks to repay the loans because they're an extremely advantaged and privileged group. They get the money at zero interest, they loan it out at 7%, so it's really easy for them to pay back those loans. Young people are not in that situation. They don't have the jobs that we need. We don't have an economy that can employ them. So here's what I'm suggesting. That debt is largely owned now by the federal government, the vast bulk of it. I'm suggesting that the Federal Reserve actually buy that debt like it did for Wall Street, but in this case, that it buy that debt and it basically declare that debt null and void, which essentially means that the Federal Reserve would be expanding the money supply into the hands of young people so that they can spend it into the economy instead of having to pay back the loans with their hard-earned dollars. They now own their hard-earned dollars. So what I'm
hold on,
saying...
let me make sure that we understand it. So the Federal Reserve would buy the debt.
Yes.
So they would expire the debt, whatever
right.
the accounting equivalent is. We're
Yes.
talking about 1.3 or so trillion dollars.
That's right.
And then you're saying they would also take that amount of money in new currency and give it to the people who held the loans?
No, what I'm saying is that they basically cancel the loans, which is like giving it's almost like giving students money. They don't actually give them money. This means that instead of the students paying the bank,
so they retire the entire debt. So you have to go to Congress and say,
money.
Here's why I think we should expand the debt by $1.3 trillion.
But Chris, and I think we need to make a corrective. Quantitative easing was the creation of money. They created money and handed that money to the banks at the tune of $85 billion a month. Let me say that one more time. $85 billion a month. So if there's mechanisms that can be found to basically prop up the banks, why can't the American people get propped up once in a while?
It's a legitimate question. It's a legitimate question. Believe me, I take no pleasure in being the person who has to check the idea of not having any student debt. But that, unfortunately, is the job. I don't know that that's the best analogy. It is the right political imperative. You found a way to do this, you should find a way to do that. I don't know that it's the same mechanisms involved, though. That's why I'm asking the question.
And I think the point here is that there are many potential mechanisms. Congress could also be asked to come up with the money. But there's another way to do this, and that is the Federal Reserve doesn't need the permission of Congress. This is an act that the Federal Reserve can take on its own. Yes, we would sort of owe that money to ourselves. We would owe that money to ourselves. But as a nation, we have the capacity to do that. We can decide to spend money on ourselves. And in particular, we can decide to spend money on our younger generation who currently does not have a future. Who is more worth spending money on than our younger generation?
All right, let's get another question from the audience. This is Maria Cristina Garcia. She's a U.S. Army veteran. She now works as a Veterans Outreach Coordinator. She does not know who she's voting for yet. What's your question?
Hello, good evening. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Dr. Stein, I have a little bit of a concern. I know that you're advocating for boycotting Israel, and I just want to know, why do you single out Israel, being that they are a democratic ally to us? Why don't you do the same for other Middle Eastern states, and many of which are committing horrific crimes and abuse of people?
So let me reassure you, Maria, that's exactly what we are doing. And I've been very careful to avoid that pitfall of targeting Israel. And what we say is that we are turning over a new chapter, because we ourselves have been as guilty of this as any of our allies. But what we would say under a green administration, if we turn the White House into a green house, what we're saying is that our foreign policy will be based on international law and human rights. So when we say to Israel that we will not continue to give you $8 million a day when the Israeli army is occupying territory in Palestine, conducting home demolitions and assassinations and things of that sort that are recognized by the UN, we're not going to do it for the Saudis either. They don't get a pass whatsoever, nor for that matter does Egypt get a pass with their incredible human rights violations, and we're giving them not as much, but we're giving them billions of dollars a year.
Have you advocated to boycott Saudi Arabia?
Yes, absolutely. That's right.
Another follow-on this would be that Israel is not Saudi Arabia or Egypt. It certainly occupies a special alliance with the United States, and supporters would argue faces an existential threat that others do not. So do you see Israel as being a special ally and in a unique defensive position in that part of the world?
Well, you know, I happen to be of Jewish origins, so yes, I have a special connection to Israel, and I have family members who are living there part-time. But, you know, I don't think we are doing Israel a favor by condoning a policy that makes Israel very insecure, that makes Israel the target of hostility from its neighbors. And in fact, the current, government of Israel, the Netanyahu government, has a sponsor from someone, a casino magnate living here in the U.S. who's funding and supporting a very aggressive and hostile policy. He's not even living there. I don't think that's good for someone to be influencing Israel's policy when they don't have to live with the consequences.
Well, from a starting position, I understand you have family relations there, but do you believe that as a state that Israel has a preference as an ally that Saudi Arabia and Egypt or anyone else does not? Do you believe they're a special ally, yes or no?
I believe all of our allies are special allies. Israel and all of them. We are all members of the human family. I think we have responsibilities to everyone to create a world that works for all of us. And by sponsoring a very hostile military policy that violates international law, that doesn't do us any favors. There are people in Israel who are really working for human rights, who are actually building community with the Palestinians. There are human rights groups that are building trust, that are building community, and that are building confidence. These are the groups that we need to be lifting up to create a Middle East that's going to work for everyone.
Let me get another question in here. Lacey Dickinson, she's a project manager from Philadelphia. She co-founded a social media company called Feminist News. She says she's voting for you in November. What's your question?
Good evening.
Good evening.
As everyone knows, the Black Lives Matter movement has raised a lot of awareness around violence that's been committed against people of color, and it's also exposed a great incompetence in many local police forces. What do you think the role of the federal government should be in kind of structuring and working with local forces, and how would you work to ensure that officers are brought to justice who kill citizens?
Great. Thank you. Really critical question. Very much the question of the hour when we're seeing a new tragedy unfold almost on a daily basis. So this is a crisis, and it's very much related, I think, to an ongoing crisis of racial injustice that really has been kind of a continuing legacy from the criminal institution of slavery on which this country was founded. From slavery to lynchings to Jim Crow to segregation, mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and now police violence. So we have a deep problem here. And I want to suggest a couple of things we need to do. Some of them are focused, and some of them are very big. So, number one, we need to ensure that every community has a civilian review board so that communities are in charge of their police instead of having police in charge of their communities, for starters. We need to ensure that every community has access to an independent investigator. So it doesn't require an act of God in Washington, D.C. in the Department of Justice to find out what happened. I think any death at the hands of police needs to be investigated. And then on the big end, we're calling for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so that we can actually understand what is this living legacy of fear, of racism, of incredible racial bias, that the police violence is just the tip of the iceberg, because we have bias in our judicial system, in our prison system, you know, which is mass incarceration largely for people of color, an economy where the average African-American family has 5 cents of wealth on the dollar that an average Caucasian family has, just through the cumulative impact of economic bias and unfairness. Incredible health disparities, 7 years off the average lifespan of someone just for living while black. You know, there are incredible just disparities and violence, economic violence, social violence, that has to be dealt with. We're calling for this Truth and Reconciliation Commission so we can share our stories, we can share music, art, have a facilitated conversation that our campaign hopes to help engender, so that we can come to terms with who we are as human beings and overcome this legacy that's dividing us.
Mr. Baraka, I want you to weigh in on this. I've read a lot of what you've had to say about this, and there is a preconception right now very often that this problem begins in the end, ends with police because of high-profile cases. But you know that when you look at policing, certain things become clear. One, there's certainly room for improvement. Nobody's going to argue on the other side of that and be reasonable. But this is not a big percentage of policing, and it seems that the focus on bad policing winds up overshadowing all of these other issues that are going on in these communities where you do have very high crime rates, and why you have high crime rates, and why you have such a high number of exchanges with police in those communities, and what the opportunities and educations and family stability issues are. Do you believe that that's doing a disservice? That while the Black Lives Matter movement and others like it are well-intentioned to a certain degree to want to bring attention to it, if you don't talk about those issues and you just talk about police, you're not only exaggerating a problem, but you're also refusing to discuss what the real root issues are.
Well, the real root issue is the issue of oppression, systematic oppression. And I think that the courageous activity of our young folk bringing attention to the war being waged against black people and brown people, and Native people in this country is the kind of attention we have to have. That basically we have the consequences of oppression, but what we are dealing with now on almost a daily basis is the consequences of individuals, departments with the power of being able to use legitimate violence, using violence against their own citizens. So we have a situation where a war is being waged against black people in this country. And basically what we have to do is call attention to that. So the other issues are important. They aren't connected, because what we're talking about a system of oppression, with the police being the front line of that oppression. So we have to talk about that. We can't evade it. We can't erase it. We have to deal with it. Why do we have the kind of policing we have in these black communities? Because we have colonized territories where basically the police are acting like a military force, and they behave like a military force, because you are policing basically a population that at this point in history is almost superfluous. That in the larger economy, now we have become the problem people that Du Bois talked about. So basically the way you deal with a problem people now, you police them, you incarcerate them, you kill them. So that is the major contradiction right now that we have to deal with. And the American people have to deal with this, because, you know, people are not going to allow themselves to be oppressed like that in that way. They're going to struggle, and struggle relentlessly.
Let's Let's take a moment here, too, because this is an introduction to a much larger audience than is used to getting exposure to the Green Party ticket. Let's get some personal information out there. I'll start with you. We were talking before. I'm not going to ask you to sing, but I will say that you used to, you play instruments, and you used to be the lead singer in a band called Somebody's Sister, and you do have a beautiful voice. So tell us about that in your life. I'm not going to ask you to sing, but tell us about singing in your life, what it meant to you.
Singing and music, I have to say, just gave me incredible courage to do everything else in my life. It was really kind of a foundation for me that connected me to people and communities and just kind of our higher selves, and it gave me a sense of the infinite potential that we have to sort of choose our existence, to make our existence something very special, powerful, mysterious, and for me that energy carries on. I don't get to play music very much these days, and I'm so out of shape I wouldn't inflict it on anybody. But for me it's a constant source of inspiration.
Have you heard Somebody's Sister?
Not yet, but I'm going to check it out.
You have a treat coming your way, my friend. Let me tell you that right now. Ajamu Baraka, you have achieved something that is very difficult in today's digital age. It is very difficult to find any personal information about you on the internet. I'm able to find so much about what you've written about, where you've traveled, how you've been rewarded for your efforts in human rights, but I don't know much about you as a person. What do you want people to know?
I'm a father and a grandfather. I have 4 wonderful children, all adults. I have 16 grandchildren, and I'm a pretty boring person. Basically, that's why it's not much out there. I like spending time with my family. I have a very special person in my life now, a significant other who is a revolutionary like myself, and our life basically is the struggle. It's being with people with like mind, being with people who believe in the possibility of a new world. So, I read and hang out and just try to enjoy life and be with my family.
Let me ask one more question for each of you. A hero, huge concept, takes on a lot of different applications in our culture. When you think about a personal hero to you, who comes to mind?
Martin Luther King.
Kills you that I asked her that first, Mr. Baraka, because now you can't go there. So who's your choice?
I have someone from that same period, Fannie Lou Hamer.
Oh, tell people about why.
Fannie Lou Hamer was a black woman from a plantation in Mississippi who didn't have formal education, but what she did have was a spirit of resistance. And she became a leader of the movement in Mississippi and really across the country. And she was famous for going to the Democratic Convention in 1964 and demanding with other members of SNCC and the Mississippi Freedom and Democratic Party to sit in place of the Mississippi Democratic Party, because they said that the party from Mississippi was illegal and that the real representatives were the black masses and other progressive whites in Mississippi. And they were denied, of course, and Johnson tried to eliminate her influence, but she was a hero to millions of people around the world. She's my hero.
Dr. Jill Stein, Mr. Ajamu Baraka, thank you very much for taking the opportunity. Special thanks to our audience here and to you at home. That is it for the CNN Green Party Town Hall. Time now for CNN Tonight with Don Lemon.